Well, as they're finishing taking the offering, I suppose I'll get started. Someone told me this week that I was crazy. They're probably right. I played the music, I wrote a sermon, and I did VBS. I'm feeling a little tired this morning, so no, that wasn't supposed to be positive. That was me setting you up for a sermon that's just going to be okay. All right? So I'm just greasing the skids so that you forgive me for what's about to come. So I'm already going to have to work on Sam for the notes that I missed. So for you all, we'll see how we make it, all right? I want to talk to you today about surprises just a little bit. In our culture, we love surprises. In fact, one genre movie that people love to watch is horror movies, just for that feeling of surprise when someone jumps out. I've been trying to get my wife to watch the movie It with me, to no avail. She doesn't like to be scared or have things jump out on her, so that's not working so much. But there are surprises that are positive and not so negative. For example, like if you've ever been to a ball game before where they bring out a soldier who's been away at war and they have the kids turned away and they're looking at the stadium and their father or mother who's been away comes out. That moment is often a tearjerker for people there. It's a surprise that is positive for people. We like to ride on roller coasters, and I didn't know the roller coasters were going to bless people today, but all right. But when that loop-de-loop or that upside-down turn comes when you're not expecting it, that surprise is what we get off the roller coaster talking about. We have a thing for surprise birthday parties in our culture when people think of us. This is great. This is better than walking around with my Bible. Thank you. We love it when we get a card in the mail, probably mostly because it's not a bill. But when there's a card, a thoughtful, handwritten card, something addressed by hand to us, we love that, especially when we weren't expecting it. We also love to laugh at people when they're not expecting something to happen, when they make a mistake, when something out of the ordinary, when normal is happening and the abnormal happens. We love to be surprised. I've got a video that I want to show real fast of people who are doing mundane things and are very surprised by a lack of balance or a fall or a mistake that they make. Watch these surprises. Some of those people were surprised, but they shouldn't have been surprised. Just a few of them. We do love surprises. We especially love it when the surprise and the joke is on someone else. But if that was ever us, falling off the ledge or going over a floaty or anything, we'd be much more disturbed. We're going to read a story today in Acts chapter 10 about surprise. And particularly Peter is the one who is surprised. He is caught way off guard. And here's the problem. As much as we like surprises, especially when they're positive surprises, I suspect that many of us don't like it when we're surprised by God. We're most comfortable, I think, when we've placed God in a comfortable little box where God behaves exactly like we expect God is going to behave, that God does and calls and speaks in ways that we expect, in measurable, small, incremental calls. When God is manageable and we make God small enough that we can fit him in the image we want him to fit in, God doesn't surprise us and therefore asks very little of us. Peter, on the other hand, is going to be deeply surprised by God, because it goes against everything he's ever learned in Jewish school and reading the scriptures and his experiences in synagogue and in the temple. Peter has an idea of how God behaves and acts and thinks and calls. And I'm going to explain to you how Peter's idea of how God behaves is rooted in a reasonable place. But God calls him beyond his own reason and his own understanding. So let's go ahead and read we're going to read the first 8 verses of Acts chapter 10, and then we'll walk the way through the rest of the story. I'd invite you to stand with me as we invite ourselves into the story of Cornelius and Peter and find what it is that Peter is going to have to do. Acts chapter 10, verse 1. At Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion in what was known as the Italian regiment. He and all his family were devout and God-fearing. He gave generously to those in need and prayed to God regularly. One day at about 3 p.m, he had a vision. He distinctly saw an angel of God who came to him and said, "Cornelius." Cornelius stared at him in fear. "What is it, Lord?" he asked. The angel answered, "Your prayers and gifts to the poor have come up as a memorial offering before God. Now send men to Joppa and bring back a man named Simon who is called Peter. He is staying with Simon the tanner, whose house is by the sea." When the angel who spoke to him had gone, Cornelius called 2 of his servants and a devout soldier who was one of his attendants. He told them everything that had happened and sent them to Joppa. The word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. Well, this story is pretty straightforward and simple enough. We have a centurion here who's considered the enemy of the state by any good Jew. He is a Roman commander who has as many as 100 soldiers underneath his command. He is considered by most Jews to be enemy, unclean, idolatrous. This man is problematic to your average Jew and your average devout person of God. They would consider Cornelius to be, again, unclean and idolatrous because he was not Jewish. He could not be Jewish, and he was part of the Roman military. And so Cornelius is problematic, except for the fact that in this story, God comes and speaks to him through an angel and tells him to do something that is moderately insane. Send some of your people to a guy that you don't know and tell him to come back to your house. If God told you to do that, hey, send someone to Baltimore. They don't know you. Tell them to come over to your place. You'd be like, no, thank you. But Cornelius, the idolater, the unclean, the outside of the Jewish people person, hears the voice of God and does exactly what the voice of God calls him to do. Peter has a little bit more trouble. Because at the same time that God is working with Cornelius, God is also working with Peter at Simon the tanner's house. Peter is a devout Jew who wakes up every morning and does his prayers. He finds a quiet place. He does everything right. He follows all the laws. He gets it just right. So Peter is staying at Simon the tanner's house, and he goes up onto the roof, and he sits there quietly doing his daily prayers when the voice of God that spoke to Cornelius also speaks to him. And what happens to Peter is that as he's praying, a sheet falls down from heaven onto the roof where he is sitting. And on top of it is snakes and pigs and all sorts of unclean animals that are made explicitly clear to Peter from the very beginning of the Torah, the Jewish law, the first 5 books of the Bible. And so Peter sees all of this and he backs off and he's like, whoa, I can't be seen near these things. And then the voice of God speaks to him and says, get up, Peter, kill and eat. Well, Peter is a smart Jew. Peter knows the law backwards and forward. He studied it. He has it memorized. He knows what he can kill and eat. So he immediately recognizes this as a test of God. In all of his piety, in all of his goodwill towards God, he says, you can't trick me, God. That's unclean. Now, Peter had good reason to say this and think this. If you know your Old Testament stories of Daniel, you remember him? He was the guy that's thrown in the lion's den, right? You remember Daniel? Well, Daniel's story starts out with us. He was taken out of his homeland and brought into exile in Babylon, and he was immediately thrown into the king's quarters as a slave. So he was working in the place that King Nebuchadnezzar, the powerful ancient king of Babylon, lived and ruled from. And Daniel and his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, put in a dungeon down in the bottom of the king's house, were brought the food from the king's table and laid before him. But that food of Babylon was considered unclean. And so Daniel looked at it and said, I'm not going to eat that. My God has given me strict instructions about dietary laws. In fact, in ancient Israel, probably the most common problem between the Gentiles and the Jews was how to eat with each other. If you want to know why they had relational problems, it wasn't simply religious, although it was birthed out of their religion, but if they were going to have dinner with a Gentile, there were very different understandings of how you come to the table, what could make its way to the table, how you cleaned yourself to sit at the table. And so Gentiles were considered physically unclean, and the food they ate was considered unclean. And so there was a problem sitting at a table with Gentiles. And you and I both know that even in our society today, if you want to make friends, you invite them to your table. You sit and have a meal with them. And Gentiles and Jews could not have a meal with each other. Now, Daniel is an embodiment of this story. The king's soldier down in the dungeon says, listen, we can't have you weakening up. We can't have you looking like you're not eating. King Nebuchadnezzar will come after me if you are weak and frail. Eat the food I've given you. And Daniel makes a deal with him. He says, listen, me and my buds Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, the four of us, we will spend the next couple of weeks eating only vegetables and drinking only water. And if you think we look less frail than the rest of these people down here, then we'll eat your food. And so the guard thought that that was a fair deal. And 2 weeks later, he came back. And after 2 weeks of only vegetables and only water that Daniel had been eating, the guard looked at them and saw that they were more strapping and looking good for work and healthy than those who had been eating from the king's table. Now, this is the tradition that Peter grew up in. This sort of story was commonplace for Peter to hear as even a little boy about how God blesses those who will follow God's dietary and dining and table rules. And so when this sheet comes down from heaven, it should not be surprising to us at all that Peter wondered if this sheet was a test of God. He had seen Daniel and others tested as well, and Peter was ready. No, I will not eat unclean foods. Peter's probably real proud of himself, puffing his chest up, feeling good. God tested him. He passed the test. And then a voice from heaven came to Peter. Hey, Peter, don't call anything unclean that I made clean. Huh? And the sheet got taken back into heaven. And Peter began to think about what this meant. And then the sheet got dropped again, the same unclean animals. And the same voice from heaven says, get up, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter said, no, I'm not falling for this. And again, the sheet was taken and the voice came again. Peter, do not call anything unclean that I have made clean. Now Peter is really wondering what is going on. And then it happened again. A third time, the sheet comes down from heaven right before him. All the animals of the earth that he has known to be unclean his whole life. And the voice comes from heaven one more time. Get up, Peter, kill and eat. And Peter is just confused at this point. Until then, as he was thinking, we're told 3 different times with 3 different words. He was wondering. He was thinking. He was hesitating. These words come up in the scriptures. Peter was really conflicted because he believed the voice of God was speaking to him, but the voice of God was contradicting everything he learned in church as a child. What in the world is Peter supposed to do? Until the Spirit of God spoke to him and clued him in. Listen, Peter, there's a man who's coming to find you. They'll be knocking on the door any minute now. Whoever they are, whatever they want, go with them. Well, thanks, God. I mean, would you be real excited if the voice of God said this to you? Hey, there's someone going to knock on your door. Wherever they want to go, you just follow, okay? This is an act of faith that Peter has to go through. And he's pondering and wondering what in the world all of this means when knocking on the door is men from a centurion, unclean according to the Jewish law. And he begins to connect it together, that those who he had understood to be unclean and the food that he understood to be unclean, God is inviting him to encounter both. Peter knows the voice of God spoke to him, so he opens the door, greets them in. They tell him about Cornelius, then the centurion, who is a God follower, has been giving to the poor, has been giving alms, has been offering offerings to God. And Peter starts connecting the boxes, understanding that perhaps God is doing something new. And so Peter packs all of his bags and he goes with them to Cornelius' house. And when he gets to Cornelius' house, some very strange things happen. The centurion comes and falls at Peter's feet. Centurions aren't just falling at people's feet, especially Jewish people's feet. And Peter invites him to stand up, that he's only a man himself. And so Peter is confused. He says, it is against my law for a Jew like me to associate with a Gentile like you. But Peter says this, he learned his lesson. God has told me that I should not call any man impure or unclean. And so Peter begins to walk around the house of this Gentile. And he starts seeing what God is doing in the family and in the house. He hears the story of how Cornelius gives and how he takes care of his men, how he cares for the neighbors around him as well. And so Cornelius then tells Peter about the vision that he saw, roughly about the same time that Peter saw his vision, and how God spoke to him clearly to go and find Peter. And Peter is confronted with facts of what God is doing. And Peter woke up that morning not thinking that he was going to be having dinner with any kind of Gentile. But he hears that God is working in a Gentile's life. And he knows that God is working in his life. And Peter comes out with this line, a powerful, powerful line. And that's a shifting line in the book of Acts. Verse 34 says, "Then Peter began to speak. I now realize how true it is that God does not show favoritism, but accepts men from every nation who fear him and do what is right. You know the message God sent to the people of Israel through the good news of peace through Jesus Christ, who is Lord of all. You know what has happened throughout Judea, beginning in Galilee after the baptism John preached, how God anointed Jesus of Nazareth with the Holy Spirit and power, and how he went around doing good and healing all who were under the power of the devil, because God was with him." And so Peter finishes his preaching to him. And what ends up happening after he tells them about the forgiveness of sin is that Peter sees the Holy Spirit descend like the sheet did on top of the roof into the people's lives. The Spirit descends on these Gentile people. And Peter's eyes are probably like this big now. Because he was prepared when they were praying in the upper room in chapter 2 for the Spirit to come upon him. Peter was ready for that. Peter was ready to go out in the streets and see Jews from all over the world, people who kept Torah law, people who were holy and clean. He was prepared for the Spirit to come upon them. He was not prepared for the Spirit to come upon the enemy. He was not prepared for a Gentile, someone who was unclean, someone who didn't know the law, someone who didn't know the scriptures. He was not prepared for the Spirit to come upon a person like that. But when Peter saw what the Spirit was doing, how the Spirit was acting, Peter said, I don't know how anyone could disagree that you all should be baptized. And so Peter grabs some water. They may go out into a pool in the centurion's yard. And he takes the whole family, not just Cornelius, who was head of household, but all of the wife and children and slaves and men, the whole household, everyone who was part of Cornelius' life was brought into the baptismal font and invited into the Christian family. This story, we should not miss how radical this story is. Peter, in fact, is going to spend the next 3-4 chapters at different points arguing with Jewish Christian people that what he did was ordained by God. There were many people who were questioning Peter's sanity and holiness and his discernment of the voice of God. There was deep confusion about whether or not the people of the world, the Gentiles, were welcome into this Christian faith. But Peter was confident because he heard the voice of God and he watched what the Spirit was doing. I wonder how good we've become at watching what the Spirit is doing. Oftentimes we know our scriptures really well. And it's amazing to me how often the scriptures can fit with our work of making it malleable right into our vision of the way the world should be. I see people on all sides of issues utilizing and taking the scripture to mean exactly what they need it to mean so that they don't have to change. People take the scriptures and they can bend it and they can twist it to fit whatever comfortable narrative they have. Peter was surely very tempted to do just that, to say no to what the Spirit was doing because he was armed with the Scriptures. But the Spirit was at work in a way that Peter couldn't deny. The Spirit was speaking to him and bending and shaping and molding him. The Spirit was speaking to Cornelius, someone that it surprised him that the Spirit was working on. But when the Spirit was at work, Peter could not deny what God was doing. But Peter had to know the Spirit to know what the Spirit does. This is such an important thing here. We can claim the Spirit's doing anything if it fits our narrative, just like we can claim the Scriptures are doing anything we want it to if it fits our narrative. We have to know the Spirit to know what the Spirit is doing. We have to open up our hearts and our lives and our minds. We have to be prepared to be surprised by God. Because the sort of God that Peter is following into the centurion's house doesn't fit into a box of our own creation. This God that Peter is listening to isn't the sort of God that we take and we fold up and we put into our heart and keep it there until we need it. This is the sort of God that is dynamic and active in the world, that is working on behalf of others beyond just me, working simultaneously in each of our lives, molding us and shaping us and drawing us and calling us towards the kingdom. We have to be aware that the Spirit is active in more than just what we see in ways that we expect the Spirit to be active. We have to know the Spirit in order to follow the Spirit. So where do we begin? Where do we begin in knowing this Spirit that Peter knew? Well, first of all, we have to have listening ears. But I think Paul gives us some help as well in Galatians. In Galatians chapter 2, I think it's chapter 6, he talks about the fruit of the Spirit, which is maybe helpful for us. If we want to know what the Spirit does and where the Spirit is going, the Spirit looks like the fruit of the Spirit. And so when we see these things at work in our world, we can get a sense that the Spirit is present in some way. Paul says that the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. And as if he knows we're reading this on the other side of Peter's story, he says, against such things there are no law. Again, the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. These are the things that the Spirit brings about out of his people. And so when we see these qualities at work in our world, maybe even in surprising places, people that we otherwise discerned as enemy, otherwise discerned as problematic, otherwise discerned as unclean, otherwise discerned as not really having it all together, when we see love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control, we can get a real sense that the Spirit is present in some way. But I also ask you this question, a more personal one. Is the Spirit at work in your life? It's one thing to judge and discern if it's at work around us. But are these qualities that are coming up out of us as well? When people think of you, when people relate to you, when people understand that you are Christian and Christ follower, do they see the fruit of the Spirit coming up out of you? Or do they sense the works of the flesh? If this Spirit, who is guiding Peter into strange waters, into strange places, and lives, entire households are being changed because Peter rightly discerned the call of the Spirit in his world, is that same Spirit at work in you? Does your story get written by the Spirit at work in you? When people look at you, do they sense love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control? Peter's astonished, we're told, that the Holy Spirit was poured out on Gentiles. Astonished. Any good Jew would have been astonished. But he couldn't deny that the people were praising God, speaking in tongues, and the Spirit had made itself known in a surprising place. Peter asks, can anyone keep these people from being baptized? The conviction of my heart upon reading this text this week is, where do I place myself in this story? Do I place myself as the one who follows the Spirit into surprising places? Or do I find that all too often I'm that anyone who would keep them from being baptized? Am I following the Spirit that the Spirit would be formed in me? That I would be a person of love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control? Or am I the kind of person who hoards the Spirit in a box for myself when I need to pull it out, when I need to feel good, when I need something? Or am I seeing a much more robust Spirit at work in the world, at work even in my enemies, finding that I am called to my enemies to show them the Spirit, to point them towards the Spirit, to point them towards the baptismal font that cleanses them of their sin and makes them friend? How often are we Peter on the roof, building barriers between us and others? And how often are we the Peter that says yes to the Spirit and goes to surprising places to do surprising things for the sake of people we may even consider enemy? The book of Acts is an incredible story of incredible transformation. Many of us could point to a story of someone we've known in our life who's been the recipient of that incredible transformation. Hateful people, drug-addicted people, alcohol-soaked homes, people with foul mouths, people with bad marriages, people filled with selfishness. We know people like this who have been transformed radically by the power of the Spirit. We know what God can do when God gets a hold of someone. And the question that Acts keeps asking me over and over and over is, why is this not happening in our world today? What has changed? And I suspect the answer that I keep seeing is people like Peter, who instead of arguing with God over the call that the Spirit is placing on his life, he's saying yes, no matter the consequences, following God into surprising places and declaring the possibilities of forgiveness and transformation. Christian people today so often speak words of condemnation and damnation. And Peter instead is going to those who he thought were condemned and telling them about the possibilities of life. And they receive it. Now that's startling news. That is startling news, but it's good news. What is the Spirit saying to us? Who are our enemies that we have made that God is inviting us to call friend? Who are those that we are sure are unclean, are short of the goal? Who are those who are filled with sin and filth in our life that we have shut out in the name of our own personal purity? Is God calling us today? Get up, kill and eat. Do not call impure what I have made clean. But again, for us to do this work, we have to know the Spirit. It's no good for us to just run around haphazardly in this world. We have to know the Spirit in an intimate way that when the Spirit talks to us, we know it's the Spirit speaking. We need to have a radical openness in our heart and life that if we're just praying on top of a roof, it's possible that God could descend a sheet to us and we would see it. I believe fully that God is not done with his project of salvation in this world. I believe fully that God is still making clean those that we want to see as unclean. I believe fully that God has people in each of our lives, in our spheres of influences, our places that we go to live and work, that God is working on now, that we could be a part of their radical transformation. We could be. But do we know the Spirit that is doing this work in the world? Are we intimate with this Spirit? Can we hear the voice of this Spirit? Can we see this Spirit that's at work in the world? Peter was prepared because he sought the Spirit daily. He did his prayers. He knew the voice of the Spirit, so when the Spirit spoke to him, he had to sit back and think and wrestle and work on what God was doing. We're going to sing a final song together about coming to the altar. And of course, it would be appropriate that we opened the altar in such a song. But I think what's at risk, or what's at stake for us today, is who this Spirit is and whether or not we know this Spirit. If this Spirit spoke to us, would we even be aware that that's what was happening? I can tell you from experience with many people and myself that God will answer the prayer of filling you with the Holy Spirit. If you want to know the Spirit intimately, God will answer that prayer. If you want to be a part of God's reconciliation with this world and not in enemy making like the world is all about, if you want to be a part of that reconciliation work that God is doing, the kind of reconciliation work that causes a Jew and Gentile to sit at a table with each other and laugh and eat together and befriend one another, if you want to see people who you thought were sinners become radically devoted followers of Jesus Christ, it starts by knowing the Spirit who's doing that work in the world. So if you would like to know that Spirit, if you would like to develop a relationship with that Spirit, if you would like to learn what that voice sounds like, today's as good a day as any. And the altar will open, and all you have to do is pray that God would make God's Spirit known to you. And you will learn as you pray that prayer that God will make himself known to you. So let's sing this song together. Would you stand with us? If you'd like to come and pray, the altar is open for you to do so.